America has been plagued with unspeakable crimes and unexplained phenomena that have captured nationwide attention and intrigue, demanding answers and retribution. However, many of these mysteries never get explained. Mysteries to this day that are still thwarting the best efforts of countless law enforcement and investigative teams. Serial killers never identified. Treasures lost. Murderers never caught. And conspiracy upon conspiracy spinning into tangled webs of inconclusive evidence and unresolved truths. This compelling documentary series presents a countdown of America's 60 most notorious unsolved mysteries and crimes in a dramatic compilation revealing these unanswered questions in 10 fascinating episodes. Here we are, the beginning of America's top 25 unsolved mysteries and crimes. 25 through 20. A famous outlaw who escaped his grave. An infamous gangland massacre never solved. And a secret mob assassin revealed. In the America of 1950, there was only one crime greater than murder. And that greater crime was to be a commie. The Cold War was raging. The Soviet Union, the Red Menace, was out to destroy our way of life. And a little-known senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, said he could prove it. Said he held in his briefcase the names of communist supporters at the highest levels in the U.S. government. Just the year before, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. Terror reigned across America. Now the Soviet Union could do to us what we had done to Japan. The outcry at the time was, who gave away our secrets? It had to be espionage. Espionage by a vast spy ring of American communist supporters. Supporters dedicated to the overthrow of our beloved democracy and capitalism. In that same year, 1950, American communists Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were arrested for passing information about our nuclear projects to the Soviet Union. McCarthyism and the Red Scare were vindicated. There were commie spy rings. But how could any true American do such a thing?
I think you have to remember that communism really used to be a much more widespread movement in the United States, especially in certain areas, New York being one of those areas. There's a lot of people who are really passionately supporting this idea of the workers' paradise and what they think that the Soviet Union is putting forward. So I think that the Rosenbergs may well have been true believers. And the other thing to remember is that once you start down that road, you do a little bit of espionage, and now they own you. Because now they can blackmail you into doing more and more, so you end up getting in over your head.
The Rosenbergs were quickly put on trial in 1951 and executed 2 years later. The first Americans ever to be executed for treason. But questions remained. Were they actually guilty of espionage? particularly, was Ethel guilty or just a scapegoat? And did the punishment fit the crime? Remember, it took 3 shots of electricity until, with smoke coming out of her head, she finally died. For many years after, that execution became the cause célèbre for many liberals.
To those on the left, the conviction and execution of the Rosenbergs for stealing the secret of the atom bomb revealed a society caught in the thrall of hysterical McCarthyism. So when in 1980, the Rosenberg sons, under the Freedom of Information Act, had the FBI files on the case revealed, everyone on the left assumed that it would fully and finally vindicate the Rosenbergs. What the files revealed was not nearly so clear-cut.
These documents revealed that Soviet intelligence obtained rough blueprints of the first U.S. atomic bomb, blueprints that sped up the Soviet atomic bomb project, blueprints that led them to avoid dangerous tasks to determine the critical mass needed to create an atomic explosion. However, the documents also show that the Soviet atomic project was first and foremost a product of their own scientific talent. But the documents also named names. And prominent among these names were Julius Rosenberg and Ethel's brother, David Greenglass.
The government did not emerge from the new investigations with clean hands. The new evidence against Julius Rosenberg was damning, but the evidence against Ethel Rosenberg was much flimsier. In fact, the FBI files made clear that the only reason that Ethel Rosenberg was prosecuted was to pressure Julius to confess and to name names. In fact, the most shocking evidence in the new files was a document that revealed that as Julius was executed, FBI agents were standing by in case he decided he was ready to confess. And one of the questions that they were prepared to ask him was your wife cognizant of your activities? In other words, even as they were about to execute the Rosenbergs, they were uncertain about Ethel's guilt.
So, the question remains, were the Rosenbergs sacrificial lambs on the altar of McCarthyism? A warning to and from fanaticism?
What is this, a pinch? No, just bringing you a Valentine. Don't you know it's Valentine's Day? Oh, yeah, I forgot. Come on, line up, you guys. Over there. All 7 of you. What's the gag? Is the heat on? Plenty. Face the wall. Put your mitts up. All of you.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains 80 years later the bloodiest, most infamous mass shooting in American history, and the biggest unsolved murder in Chicago history.
Al Capone is trying to take out one of his rival gangs in Chicago, Bugsy Moran's guys, and they set up an ambush in a garage on Clark Street in Chicago and gunned down 7 guys on the Valentine's Day of 1929.
The cold-blooded murder of 7 men shocked not only the nation, but hard-boiled Chicagoans. Working men and women used to the daily slaughter of mafiosos during the lawless bootlegging era of Prohibition. During the Roaring '20s. Oddly, the target of the gruesome mob hit, Bugs Moran, was elsewhere.
The liquor was supposed to be coming from this shipment that was supposed to be arriving on the morning of St. Valentine's Day. We're supposed to be coming from Detroit. Moran was supposed to himself meet the truck there, which was a little unusual, but he had 7 of his men there waiting, and he was actually just running late that morning, which is why the assassination actually missed him.
Bugs Moran was lucky. No one there on that fateful morning survived. 7 men, cut to ribbons with shotguns and Thompson submachine guns. Shell casings, blood, and dead bodies littered the floor. There never has been a question about who ordered the hit. It was Al Capone, the most vengeful, violent mobster of all time. Though at the time, Capone tried to fend off suspicion.
Al Capone very carefully went on vacation during the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He was down in Florida so that nobody would possibly think that he was personally there, personally overseeing this execution.
Capone had actually tried to point the finger toward the Purple Gang in Detroit. In fact, the phone calls that were made to Bugs Moran actually came from Detroit.
What still makes this the bloodiest unsolved murder in American history is, to whom did Capone entrust his dirty work? Who had the ruthlessness, the savageness to pull off such a bloodbath?
Even to this day, we don't really know who all of the killers were. There's a very good chance that one of them was Jack McGurn, because a witness who happened to be walking by the garage that day heard one of the men who were walking inside dressed as police officers refer to one of the others as Mac, which was McGurn's nickname. So it's thought that it might have been him.
When I lived in Chicago, the guy who claimed to be a triggerman was Tony the Big Tuna Accardo, and he claimed to be one of the guys who made the shot and told a number of his acquaintances that he was one of the people who did that. So I've always thought that there was a good possibility that actually he was one of the people in there, although I know that the FBI has some issues. They're not sure that he really was.
I would guess that McGurn was probably one of them. Beyond that, I really don't know. Capone had a number of men who worked for him, but a lot of the guys who were close to him, who did a lot of his dirty work, did have alibis. In fact, McGurn was one of the few who didn't, even though he had his girlfriend, the blonde alibi they called her. Her alibi for him kind of fell apart. The interesting thing was that after the massacre took place, Capone began to distance himself from McGurn because he was just too hot. He didn't do that to anybody else.
7 men brutally shot in broad daylight. Ironically, on a holiday celebrating love. With guns blazing, it would have sounded like a war. Someone must have seen something. Someone should have broken the mob code of silence. But astonishingly, in all the decades since the St. Valentine's Day massacre, no one has ever paid for the crime.
Why wasn't anybody ever caught for this crime? Well, you got to remember, this is Chicago in the 20s, and the mob is the whole city, basically infested, and they don't really there isn't really an independent police force. There isn't really law enforcement yet, except for the federal government, and that's just coming, that is really able to handle the mob. In Chicago, in the 20s, the mob is a force unto themselves. And so that's one of the reasons that none of them were ever caught. They probably had the whole police department entirely under their thumb.
There's just been a lot of speculation. If all of the people named as one of the killers were one of the killers, there would have been, probably 25 guys who went in and massacred the Moran gang instead of just the 5 that did. So we'll probably never know. Like so many of the mob murders that took place here, especially in Chicago, when in the 1920s, you had 400 and 500 men being killed every year during the height of the beer wars. Most of the time, we have no idea who actually pulled the trigger, and we'll probably never know for sure.
I know they're widely regarded as a possible true UFO filming experience.
I'm a skeptic when it comes to UFOs, but the lights over Phoenix are really one of the most convincing possible displays. People saw a set of V-shaped lights crossing over Phoenix. Not one person, not 2 people, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people saw these. The governor of Arizona, Fife Symington, saw these lights. It was huge. It couldn't be one airplane of a normal size that we would think of, even a large airplane. It had to be something different. It gives you pause when that many people see something like that. It gives you pause, even if you're a skeptic like me.
One of the most perplexing unsolved questions is, are flying saucers real? Are we being visited by extraterrestrial spacecraft? The first highly publicized sighting of a flying saucer was reported by Kenneth Arnold on June 24, 1947. Although Arnold never specifically used the term flying saucer, he was quoted at the time as saying the shape of the objects he saw was like a saucer, a disc, or pie plate. Since then, the terms flying saucer and flying disc have stuck and are used interchangeably in the media. And since then, Americans have looked to the skies and seen hundreds, if not thousands, of what are now called UFOs, or unidentified flying objects. Many of these UFOs have purportedly been photographed both during night and day. Many have also been demonstrated to be hoaxes, or natural phenomena, such as mirages or planets. In fact, during the 1950s, there were so many sightings that the United States government established an official investigation into the possibility of UFOs. It was called Project Blue Book. A conclusion and the official government position: UFOs are not real. Curiously, the government put hundreds of thousands of dollars into radio telescopes, searching for any sign of intelligent life in the universe. But even today, a handful of sightings, photographs, and videos of UFOs remain in the category, unable to explain by any natural phenomena. Then, on one clear night over Phoenix, Arizona, something extraordinary happened.
The Phoenix lights happened March 13th, 1997, with an object being reported northwest of Phoenix up in the Prescott Valley area. Lights, very bright lights. The object appeared to have been bigger than any aircraft that the United States or Russia or any other country could get up in the air and fly at 100 miles an hour, which is what it was clocked at. It was viewed by thousands of people, numerous pictures and videos. We at MUFON have evaluated those pictures with our photo analysis, and we can't find anything wrong with the pictures. It appears that many people saw a transparent solid object. Others saw a solid object. One report of a dentist traveling along the highway from Phoenix to Tucson said that he could look out the window of his car on the driver's side and see one wing tip, and look out the window of the other side, the passenger side, and see the other wing tip. That's a pretty large craft. Everybody did report that it was 5 huge lights on the bottom of this object. Transparent or solid, we don't know. The technology that they have, if this is extraterrestrial, would allow them to do that type of thing. People can see through them, they can't see through them. We don't know why that happens, but it does happen. The object was seen by air traffic controllers at the Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix. The object was seen by commercial airline pilots that reported it. It was seen by numerous people on the ground, including Governor Symington at that time, who did see the object himself, first ridiculed it, next came out on the Larry King show and said it was extraterrestrial. He was an Air Force pilot. He says, we don't have anything that can fly that slow and be that large. We don't have anything that doesn't make noise and can do that.
So, here they are one more time. There is no doubt that thousands of people saw something real that clear Phoenix night. But what?
I'm a skeptic about UFOs. I'm not a skeptic about government keeping a lot of secrets from us. I think that UFOs serve a useful purpose for the government in that they can sit there, denying it's a UFO, but thereby creating the impression it is a UFO, where what they're really concerned with is having people not know about the secret work that they're doing.
The Phoenix lights, I believe, were extraterrestrial craft of some type. I have no idea why. Maybe it was time for them to show themselves to us, and maybe not.
"1968. It was America's most troubled year in the 20th century. The nation was losing a horrible war in Vietnam. A once popular president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was all but driven from the presidency, forced to step down, refusing to run for a second term.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president."
All across the nation, anti-war protesters raged in the streets. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th. Urban blacks set the country's largest city ablaze as they screamed out in agony over 300 years of oppression. Chaos reigned. 5 years earlier, America's knight in shining armor, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, met his death upon a dreary day in Dallas, Texas. Persistent stories circulated that the assassination was part of a large conspiracy. A conspiracy at the highest levels of government. Now, when all seemed lost, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, former Attorney General and present New York Senator, would rekindle the spirit of the new frontier. Robert Kennedy would run and become the next president. A president who would set things right again. It had been a good day. A day when Robert Kennedy won the California State Democratic primary election. A day that assured him he would win his party's nomination for the President of the United States. Then the unthinkable happened. Shortly after midnight on June 5th, 1968, in Los Angeles, California, Robert F. Kennedy was shot as he walked through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. He died at Good Samaritan Hospital 26 hours later. Once again, a lone gunman was held responsible. Once again, even more incredibly, the candidate's handlers decided on the spur of the moment to make a detour through the kitchen, where this supposedly lone assassin, 24-year-old Palestinian-American Sirhan, just happened to be waiting, with a small revolver in his hand. The coincidences just didn't seem possible. And almost immediately, the possibility of a conspiracy spread like wildfire through the country.
Sirhan, of course, is accused of killing Robert Kennedy and is still in prison for killing Robert Kennedy. And the question is it a lone gunman or was there some kind of conspiracy there? We all know that the mob had some reasons to dislike Robert Kennedy. After all, he had really cracked down on the mob as Attorney General. The CIA had some reasons to dislike Robert Kennedy. The FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, who worked for Kennedy at one point, had some reasons to dislike him. Lyndon Johnson had reasons to dislike Robert Kennedy. There's a whole lot of players there that if you want to think somebody else is involved, that could have been involved.
Of course, when Robert Kennedy was running for president in 1968, being shot down in the Ambassador Hotel in LA, there's no doubt that Sirhan was present, that he fired a pistol, but according to both the FBI and LAPD's original records, there were too many bullet holes in the kitchen for his 8-shot revolver. And we also know that Sirhan himself had ties to organized crime. One of the individuals questioned in both cases, Eugene Braden, was a long-standing member of organized crime with ties to Marcello, with ties to Mo Dalitz, with ties to mobsters all over the country and to the Teamsters Union.
Of course, as Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy had pursued Hoffa for years and essentially put Hoffa in jail. Indeed, one of Robert's long-standing goals was to put the mob out of business. What he didn't know of was his assassin's deep ties to the mafia.
Well, Sirhan had been employed at various mob-owned racetracks. Several individuals mentioned in his notebook were known to have organized crime connections. They had apparently loaned him money. They'd picked him up. He was sort of an unstable young guy, just drifting around the fringes of the mob. He was a horse walker, and he would clean up some of the stables at some of the racetracks that were at least partially owned by the mob. And a theory is that he may have been manipulated in some way, that because of his antipathy toward Israel as an Arab American, that he may have been encouraged to attempt an attack on Robert Kennedy, and that someone else was there in the crowd to back him up. A security guard named Thane Caesar, who sporadically bragged of his mob connections, was seen with a gun in hand standing behind Kennedy. It's known that the fatal shots struck Kennedy from behind. According to Thomas Noguchi, the coroner, the headshot that killed him was fired from less than 2 inches away. Every witness agrees that Sirhan was always in front of Kennedy and never got closer than 6 feet. So Thane Caesar, the security guard, admitted that he had a .22 caliber revolver identical to Sirhan's. He claimed he sold it before the assassination. That later turned out to be false. The sales records were found that it wasn't sold until September 1968. We know that LAPD, on the ballistic tests for the bullets recovered from Kennedy, recorded a serial number of a revolver that was not Sirhan's. Later they claimed that that was a clerical error, that there had been a mix-up in the lab and it was just a typo. Of course, by that time both revolvers had been melted down, so nobody could ever test them. Rather convenient, just as the ceiling panels with the extra bullet holes had been removed and destroyed from the ambassador's kitchen.
Both of the Kennedy assassination conspiracies lead back to one organization whose form of justice is ultimate revenge.
It all leads back to the reasons for the mob wanted JFK dead. He didn't deliver on kicking Castro out of Cuba. and was throwing all their top men in jail. J. Edgar Hoover hated him too, so he had believed he was going to be fired if Kennedy was reelected in 1964, so he had a strong incentive not to see more than one gunman. And it's known that J. Edgar Hoover produced a report citing Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman within a few hours of the shooting, and the Warren Commission basically just ran with that. They ignored Jack Ruby's long-standing ties to organized crime. In fact, they directly lied and said they could find no ties to organized crime, even though he'd been a mobster since his teens. And Ruby was also associated with Richard Nixon. Back in the House Un-American Activities days, he had been called to testify before the committee when Nixon was a member of the committee, and some FBI agent in LA sent in a little letter asking that he be exempted from testifying, and he was.
On one side, you have the Kennedys, Robert and Jack, and on the other, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Hoffa, J. Edgar Hoover, and the mob. The Second World War started when Japanese forces attacked China in the 1930s. In 1937, Japan seized Peking, and then at Nanking they brutally destroyed the city, slaughtering upwards of 200,000 civilians and raping countless women and young girls. In Europe, Hitler's Nazis marched unopposed into Czechoslovakia and Austria. The shooting war began in September 1939, when Nazi troops invaded Poland. By June the following year, France and the rest of Western Europe had fallen. Britain was reeling and on the verge of invasion. Then came December 7th, 1941. On that fateful day, without warning, Japan attacked America's Pacific Naval Fleet in Pearl Harbor. A date, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt said to the American people,
a date which will live in infamy.
2,400 Americans killed. 19 U.S. ships, including 6 battleships, were sunk. America was outraged. An unprovoked, despicable, and dishonorable sneak attack. Revenge couldn't come soon enough. War was the only response. But was Pearl Harbor really a sneak attack? Were Roosevelt and his administration really caught unaware? Or were those men and ships sacrificed like pawns in a chess game?
To many, Roosevelt's story of an unprovoked and dastardly attack, in his speech on the date that will live in infamy, to many this didn't wash. The world was at war. Diplomatic efforts to work things out with the Japanese had failed. The entire Pacific was ready to boil over. How under these circumstances could our Army and Navy be caught napping at Pearl Harbor? For some, a more sinister explanation was called for, namely that Roosevelt knew in advance of the attack on Pearl Harbor and that he deliberately withheld information from his commanders at Pearl Harbor. His motive? To get the United States into the war.
Historians know that Roosevelt was hoping to come to the aid of the Allies. So in that respect, it might have been a small price to pay.
Among the earliest to point fingers at Roosevelt were his commanders at Pearl Harbor. Of course, they had an incentive to do so, to point fingers at anyone other than themselves. Republicans in Congress also tended to blame Roosevelt, at least for failing to put his Pearl Harbor commanders on full alert, given the increasing tensions with Japan. But as World War II came to be seen as a good war, most Republicans and most historians have put aside their suspicions about Pearl Harbor.
Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was torn between isolationism and internationalism. But while Roosevelt appeared neutral, he was in reality supplying Great Britain with destroyers and ammunition. At the same time, he ended America's trade agreement with Japan. Was this a clever ploy to provoke Japan into declaring war on the United States?
In one sense, the case against Roosevelt has stood the test of time. He definitely did provoke the Japanese, and he definitely did overstep the neutrality acts. The Lend-Lease program, for example, by which he sent arms to Britain, this was a complete fiction. No one expected the British to pay for the arms. No one expected the British to return the arms. As one Republican senator put it, lending arms is like lending chewing gum. You don't want it back.
But was setting up the Japanese enough to say that FDR purposefully left Pearl Harbor wide open to a sneak attack?
Roosevelt did deceive, Roosevelt did manipulate. Given the prevailing isolationism of the time, these were the only ways that he could act against Germany and against Japan. But did he know in advance of the attack on Pearl Harbor? No. After all, he wanted us in the war against Japan so we could win the war against Japan. And it's a hell of a lot easier to win a war against Japan if your Pacific Fleet is floating on and not below the waters of Pearl Harbor.
70 years later, the ancient relics of battleships in Pearl Harbor lie in mute testimony to the surprise attack by the Japanese. We know they did it. There is no question they attacked. And there is no doubt that Roosevelt used Pearl Harbor to take America into World War II. But is December 7th, 1941, a date which should also be remembered as a day of deceit?
There's a whole tradition of undead outlaws in America. You have theories that Jesse James got away, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid both supposedly got away. John Dillinger, there was a theory that he wasn't killed, that the FBI actually shot some guy named Jimmy Lawrence and then were afraid to admit it. And of course the same story about Billy the Kid. This was fostered also by the Young Guns movies. I think Young Guns 2, he pops up again as Emilio Estevez in his aged years.
William Bonney, Billy the Kid, a Western legend. A Western legend whose story is complex. He was both a ruthless killer and an avenging angel, an outlaw and a Robin Hood who looked after his friends. Whether you love him or you hate him, one thing is for certain: Billy the Kid was the greatest of the Wild West's anti-heroes.
You got to go with Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid had the great name, and his real name was Henry. Now, how many movies would you go see about Henry the Kid, Henry? It doesn't have the ring, doesn't know, but Billy the Kid has the ring. And he had the look, he had a Winchester. He preferred his Winchester to a pistol.
Billy the Kid was born Henry McCarty in New York City in 1859 and moved with his mother to New Mexico when he was 14. When he was 16, he killed his first man in self-defense. It was 3 years later, in the West's bloodiest range war, New Mexico's Lincoln County War, that Billy made his fearsome reputation as a cold-blooded killer. Billy worked for cattleman John Tunstall, who some say was the only father figure Billy ever had. When Tunstall was gunned down in front of Billy, there was only one thing to do: the Kid joined a group of ex-Tunstall riders who called themselves the Regulators, and he avenged the cold-blooded murder of his employer and friend. From here on to the end of his life, Billy the Kid was a fugitive from the law. The law finally caught up with him. Sheriff Pat Garrett was an old friend of Billy's and was ordered to bring Billy in, dead or alive. And that's when the story gets bizarre. Billy had a chance to leave New Mexico. Instead, Garrett caught up with Billy in Fort Sumner at the home of Pete Maxwell, the son of a rich Lincoln County rancher.
Garrett decides and just go inside the home. It's probably midnight. Without knocking on the door, he simply goes into a door that is actually Pete Maxwell's bedroom. Pete is there. Garrett goes up and sits on his bed and starts talking to him. Well, as coincidence would have it, William Bonney was in Fort Sumner at that very evening. He is with one of his paramours, but he does know that Pete Maxwell always has a beef carcass, hung on the porch. So he decides that he's going to go cut him some meat off and have a late night dinner, steak dinner. So he's got a butcher knife in his left hand to cut the meat, but as always, he carries his revolver in his right hand, no hat, and no boots. He's in his stocking feet. But he goes up to Maxwell's porch and starts cutting the meat, but then he hears noises. He hears people talking. And so he decides to go into Maxwell's room and to just find out what's going on. Who are the people, whatever. So he walks in, miraculously, can you imagine, right where Pat Garrett is. It's dark, no lights are on, no candles. And the famous line, of course, from Billy the Kid's life, he says in Spanish, ¿Quién es? Who's there? What's going on? Who's there? ¿Quién es? Pat Garrett is stunned himself because he immediately recognizes the voice, and without further ado, he pulls his gun and fires at the shadowy figure that has just come into the room and hits him in the chest, and of course it's Billy the Kid. He guns him down.
And with that shot, the youngest and most famous gunslinger of the Wild West was dead at the age of 21. Or was he?
I think the mystery of whether or not Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid in 1881 really began right afterward, because on the day after, when they went to bury the body of Billy the Kid, a lot of the people, even Garrett's men and locals there in Fort Sumner, all said that wasn't Billy the Kid. They all said that it didn't even look like him. The story just kept going for years and years until 1948, when a guy showed up whose name was William Brushy Bill Roberts. Brushy Bill claimed that he was Billy the Kid. Now, the interesting thing about him was that he wasn't looking for fame or fortune. He was looking for a pardon that had been promised to Billy the Kid by Governor Lew Wallace years before, after all the events of the Lincoln County War were over. Wallace never gave Billy his pardon, and that's all Brushy Bill wanted. In this case, he actually had the scars that Billy the Kid had. People who were survivors from the time of the Lincoln County War actually identified him and said, we're pretty sure that's Billy the Kid. Hearings were held, but his pardon was never granted. And then, as they say, broken-hearted, Brushy Bill died in 1950. Now, whether or not he was Billy the Kid, we don't know, but I think he probably was. There are a handful of people who I think, I guess you would say, got away with it. who actually escaped from whatever death or whatever justice in some cases was supposed to be carried out. They did get away, and I think that Billy the Kid was one of them.
I really don't know if Billy the Kid was killed. He certainly had enough run-ins with the law that someone would have been willing to kill him, but then again, he had been friends with Pat Garrett before too, so if it was to Garrett's advantage to kill someone or even fill in an empty grave and then go on his own way politically to try to rise to power while Billy lit out for old Mexico, I think either theory works for me.